When I was 64 years old, my daughter and her husband forged my name on a power of attorney document while I was still sedated in the ICU after open heart surgery, then sold my house of 31 years out from under me. They left $200 in cash on my hospital nightstand and a handwritten note that said, "You'll land on your feet, Dad. You always do." 12 years later, my granddaughter typed my name into a search engine for a college assignment and found a front-page article about me in the Seattle Business Journal. She called me from her dorm room in tears. Within 6 hours, I had 47 missed calls from the daughter who had walked out of that hospital room without ever once looking back. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that people who use a man's hospital bed as their starting line deserve everything that's coming to them. The light on my desk phone was blinking when I came in from the back porch. I had been sitting outside watching the fog roll in off the sound, the way it does in late October up here in the Pacific Northwest. That slow silver curtain that turns the whole inlet into something out of a dream. I was holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 76, cold coffee is the least of your problems. I sat down in the leather chair behind my desk and looked at the phone. 47 missed calls. The most recent had come in 11 minutes ago. The number was a Portland area code I didn't recognize, but the ones before it I knew. I had memorized that number a long time ago, the same way you memorize a scar. Not because you want to, but because it's always there. I called back the unknown number first. She answered on the second ring. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. I knew her voice immediately, even though the last time I heard it she was 9 years old, sitting in the dirt behind my house, trying to coax a stray cat out from under the back steps. That voice doesn't change. The little girl is always in there somewhere, no matter how many years go by. "Grandpa," she said. "Grandpa, is it really you?" I told her it was. She cried harder. She told me her name was Quinn, that she was a junior at Oregon State studying business administration, that her professor had assigned the class to research a local entrepreneur whose company had created measurable community impact in the last decade. She said she almost didn't type my name in. She almost used someone else. But something made her do it. She didn't know what. And when the results came up, she had to read the page 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. She described the article. The Business Journal piece from 2 years ago. The photograph of me in a hard hat standing in front of the first completed unit of the Anchor Point Veterans Housing Complex on the south side of Tacoma. The caption underneath called me the founder and lead contractor of the Anchor Point Foundation, a nonprofit that had broken ground on 4 permanent supportive housing developments for homeless veterans in 3 states. She said, "Grandpa, they told me you walked out on us. They told me you had a breakdown after Grandma died and just disappeared. But the article says you started your company from nothing 12 years ago. It says you were sleeping in your truck the first winter." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fog had reached the tree line. I told her she was right. I had been sleeping in my truck. It was a 2003 F-250 with a cracked rear window I'd plugged with a garbage bag and duct tape, and I drove it to a Walmart parking lot in Olympia because the security guard there had once told me when I asked that they didn't run people off overnight. I was 64 years old. I had been a licensed master electrician for 37 years, and I was sleeping in a parking lot because my own daughter had sold my house while I was in a hospital bed, hooked up to a chest drainage tube. I said, "Quinn, I didn't walk out on anyone. I was shown the door." She started to ask me something else, but the line went strange. I could hear her voice cut off mid-sentence, and then there was a muffled sound, like a hand going over the receiver. A door opening, footsteps. Then my daughter's voice came on. I hadn't heard it in 12 years. It was older, tighter at the edges, but that particular quality was still there. That practiced smoothness, the voice of a woman who had decided a long time ago that whatever she wanted, she deserved. "Dad," she said. I didn't answer. "Dad, oh my God, is it really you? We have been trying to find you for years. We've been worried sick." My grip on the phone tightened, but my heart rate stayed even. I had spent 12 years building things, structural things, foundations, framing, load-bearing walls. A man who builds for a living learns to understand what holds weight and what doesn't. What she was saying didn't hold any weight at all. Not one single pound of it. She kept talking. She said her husband's development company was in serious trouble, that they had taken on too much too fast during the last building boom, and now they were underwater, that two investors had filed civil complaints, that she didn't know what was going to happen. She said when Quinn showed them the article, she couldn't believe it. She said she needed to see me. She said that whatever happened between us in the past, we were still family, and family helped each other. I let her finish. Then I said, I'm going to give you the address of my office. Come Thursday at 2 o'clock. She agreed so fast it told me everything I needed to know. I set the phone down and looked out the window at the fog. 12 years. They had not tried to find me for 12 years. Not when I was sleeping in that parking lot. Not when I was working 16-hour days on a roofing crew in Centralia for $11 an hour. Not when I put everything I had saved into a business license and a second-hand work van and started bidding commercial electrical jobs out of a P.O. box because I didn't have a permanent address yet. They had not tried to find me then. They were trying to find me now because a 20-year-old girl had typed my name into a computer. I called my attorney the next morning. His name was Aldous, and he had been practicing business and elder law in Tacoma for 28 years. I had hired him 8 years ago to handle the legal structure of the foundation. And in that time he had become the kind of colleague who understood exactly what kind of man I was and what kind of work I wanted to do in the world. He didn't waste words. I told him about the calls. I told him my daughter was coming Thursday. He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was long for him. Then he said, How much do you want me to dig? I told him all the way down. He called me back Wednesday afternoon. I was on site at a framing project in Gig Harbor, standing in the skeletal bones of what would eventually be a 12-unit apartment building for veterans transitioning out of permanent supportive care. I stepped away from the crew and listened. My son-in-law's development company had been flagged by the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions 8 months ago. The complaint had originated from a group of private investors, mostly retired couples from the east side suburbs of Seattle, who had pooled their savings into a real estate syndication that he had marketed as a low-risk, fixed-return residential development fund. The fund had raised $3.1 million. The actual documented development costs, according to the auditors, were $900,000. The remaining $2.2 million had been moved through a series of LLCs, shell companies registered in Nevada and Wyoming, before landing in accounts used for personal expenses, luxury SUVs, private school tuition, a vacation house on the Oregon coast, a boat. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had opened a formal investigation 4 months ago. My son-in-law didn't know yet that they knew. Aldous said quietly, He doesn't need a loan. He needs cash that can't be traced back to illegal funds. He needs someone whose name is clean to make a large, documented, legitimate gift that he can use to paper over the gap in his accounts before the federal auditors take their next look. He needed me to be his alibi. He needed the grieving, discarded father to show up and play the generous patriarch, and in doing so hand him documentation that he could wave in front of federal investigators as proof the money had a legitimate source. I stood there in the November wind with sawdust on my boots and looked up through the open roof frame at the gray Washington sky. I told Aldous not to call anyone yet. I had a better idea. Thursday came. My daughter arrived at my office 12 minutes late. She was wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than my first work van. She looked around the room the way people do when they're trying to figure out how much something is worth. I watched her eyes move across the framed photographs on the wall, the groundbreakings, the ribbon cuttings, the letters from city councils and veterans organizations, and I watched the calculation happen behind her face. She sat down across from my desk and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression she probably thought looked like remorse. I let her talk. She told me a version of the last 12 years in which she and her husband were struggling heroes, who had tried to do right by everyone, and been beaten down by circumstances. She said they had taken over the house not to hurt me, but because they were terrified that I, in my grief and my physical vulnerability after surgery, would be taken advantage of by someone. She said the power of attorney had been their way of protecting me. She said they had planned to tell me about the house sale once I was stronger, But then I had left the recovery facility before anyone expected, and they hadn't been able to reach me. Not one word of it was true. What had actually happened? My wife had died 11 days before my surgery. I had been in no condition to read documents. My son-in-law had brought papers to the hospital on day 3 of my ICU stay, while I was still on a morphine drip and could barely track a conversation, and told the attending nurse they were insurance forms. He had guided my hand to the signature line. The power of attorney was notarized that same afternoon by a notary, who, I would later learn, was his college roommate. The house sold 11 days after that. 31 years I had owned it. It was paid off completely. It was worth $340,000. My daughter had received $170,000 as her cut of the arrangement. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront her with any of this while she talked. I just watched her. I noticed she never once apologized. Not for the house, not for the $200, not for the note, not for 12 years of silence while I rebuilt myself from zero. When she finished, I told her there was a foundation fundraising gala the following Saturday night at the Tacoma Landmark Center downtown. I told her it was the biggest event of our calendar year. I told her I wanted her there and her husband there, and that I planned to make a major announcement regarding the future of the organization. She looked at me with those careful, measuring eyes, and I saw the calculation tip in the direction she wanted it to go. I said, "Saturday night, I'll tell you everything you need to know about what happens next." She left looking like a woman who had already started spending money she hadn't received yet. I spent 3 days on the phone with Aldous. On Saturday evening, I stood on the second-floor mezzanine of the Landmark Center and looked down at the ballroom below. 500 people, easy. Donors, city officials, veterans advocates, journalists from 3 regional outlets, and 1 national wire service that had been covering the Anchor Point project. My daughter and my son-in-law were near the bar. He was in a charcoal suit, fitted well enough to tell you it was expensive, and she was in a dark green dress, the kind of thing people wear when they're trying hard to look like they belong somewhere. They were shaking hands and smiling at people they had never met, absorbing congratulations intended for someone else, radiating the practiced confidence of 2 people who were absolutely certain they were about to inherit something. Quinn was not with them. I had asked her to come separately. She was standing near the service corridor at the back of the room, wearing a simple black dress, holding a small envelope I had given her 2 days ago at a coffee shop near her campus. I had told her what was inside. I had told her what to do with it. I had told her the choice was entirely hers. She had not hesitated. The MC called my name. I walked down from the mezzanine and onto the stage. The applause was genuine and warm, the kind that takes a moment to build and then keeps going longer than you expect. I stood at the podium and looked out over the room. The stage lights were bright enough that I couldn't see past the first 3 rows clearly, but I could see my daughter and my son-in-law perfectly. They were in the second row. He had his hand on her lower back. They were both wearing identical expressions of patient, proprietary expectation. I began to speak. I told them that 12 years ago I had nothing. I said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact about weather or geography. I said I had no house, no savings, no vehicle more reliable than a truck with a cracked window that I slept in for 2 months in a Walmart parking lot in Olympia. I said that the only thing I had when I started over was $200 in cash and the memory of a note telling me I'd land on my feet. A quiet settled over the room. I told them that for a long time I was angry about those $200. I told them that later I decided to let that money mean something different. I told them the Anchor Point Foundation had been built on a specific number, $200, because that was the exact amount a man needs to understand he has no safety net and no one coming to save him, and that the only honest response to that realization, when it stops feeling like a punishment and starts feeling like a fact, is to get up and build something that outlasts you. I paused. I announced that the foundation was officially endowing a permanent legal defense fund for elderly Americans victimized by financial fraud perpetrated by family members. I told them it would be called the $200 Fund. I told them it would target specifically the predatory misuse of power of attorney, elder financial abuse facilitated by forged legal documents, and the exploitation of individuals during periods of medical vulnerability. I told them it would have the full cooperation of a federal law enforcement team that had been working alongside the Foundation for the past 72 hours. The room shifted. My daughter's face changed. I watched it happen, that moment when the mask doesn't fall so much as dissolve, when the thing underneath becomes visible because the person wearing it suddenly can't hold two thoughts at once. What she had believed was happening, and what was actually happening crashed into each other at full speed, and the impact showed in her eyes before she could do anything about it. My son-in-law looked toward the exits. He was too late. A door at the side of the ballroom opened. Aldous walked through it, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done something irrevocable and is entirely at peace with it. Behind him came two people in business attire with credentials on lanyards. Behind them came a uniformed officer from Tacoma PD. Then Quinn's voice came through the sound system. She was standing at the microphone near the service corridor, and the room turned toward her, the way rooms turn toward something unexpected, all at once, with that collective intake of breath that sounds like the building itself shifting. She said her name. She said she was my granddaughter. She said she had grown up being told I had abandoned my family after her grandmother died, that I was a man without character. Her voice was steady. She was 20 years old, and her voice was steadier than anyone else's in that room. She said she had spent the last 5 days reading. She had read the original deed to my house, obtained through a title search. She had read the power of attorney document, which bore my signature in handwriting that a forensic document examiner had compared unfavorably to my known samples from the same period. She had read the wire transfer records showing $170,000 moved into a joint account that was closed 10 days after the sale. She held up the envelope I had given her. She said, "My grandfather gave me this and told me the choice was mine." She opened it. Inside were two things: a USB drive containing the forensic accounting report Aldous had commissioned, and a signed statement from me describing the circumstances under which I had signed the power of attorney in the hospital. She walked to the federal investigators and handed them both. The room erupted. My son-in-law moved toward Quinn. I don't know what he intended. I don't think he knew either. The Tacoma PD officer stepped between them before he got within 6 feet of her, and then the investigators were moving, and then it was over in the way things are over when they have been building for 12 years. Not suddenly, but completely. He was placed in handcuffs at 8:47 in the evening in a ballroom, full of 500 witnesses and 3 news cameras. My daughter did not fight. She stood by the table with her hands at her sides, and when the officer approached, she held her wrists out. The green dress, the careful smile she'd worn when she walked in, none of it had been armor after all. It had just been decoration on something that was always going to fall. The charges, as Aldous read them to me later that night over the phone, were substantial. For my son-in-law, wire fraud, investment fraud, theft by deception, conspiracy. For my daughter, conspiracy, financial elder abuse, fraudulent misuse of power of attorney, a Class B felony in Washington state. The trial took 7 months. I testified twice. Both times I spoke without anger and without theater. I stated facts. I answered questions. I described the hospital room, the morphine drip, the feel of someone guiding my hand to a line on a document I couldn't read clearly. When the jury returned its verdict, my daughter looked at the floor. She didn't look at me. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal custody. My son-in-law received 9. I waited 8 months before I visited her. The visiting room at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon, is a long, low-ceilinged space with fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency you feel in your back teeth. I sat in a plastic chair and waited. She came through a door in a uniform that looked nothing like the cashmere coat. She sat down across from me and picked up the phone on her side of the glass, and I picked up mine. She looked like she had been crying recently. Not right then, but recently. The puffiness around her eyes was the kind that takes days to fully subside. "Dad," she said, "thank you for coming. I didn't think you would." I said I almost didn't. She started to apologize. It took her a while to get there, and when she did, it sounded like a woman who had been practicing in a mirror for weeks. The apology was real, I think, in the way apologies are real when a person has truly lost everything and has nothing left to protect. But it was the apology of someone who was sorry it had ended this way, not sorry it had happened. She said, "Quinn won't take my calls." I told her Quinn was doing fine. I told her she had spent the summer interning with the foundation, working with our housing case managers in Tacoma. I told her she was good at it, her mother's organizational instincts without her mother's relationship to other people's things. My daughter covered her mouth with her free hand and looked away. Then she looked back at me, and I recognized the thing that came into her eyes. The calculation, even now, even here. She said the commissary was hard. She said even $60 or $70 a month would make a difference. She said I had so much and she had nothing. She said she was still his daughter and she was sorry and please, just this once. I looked at her for a long time. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out an envelope. I slid it through the metal slot at the bottom of the glass divider. She picked it up and opened it with hands that were not quite steady. Inside was $200 in cash. Not a cent more. She stared at it. She looked up at me. I leaned forward slightly, enough to make sure she could hear me clearly through the phone. "That's what you left me," I said. 12 years ago, on a hospital nightstand, $200 and a note that said I'd land on my feet. I watched the full weight of it settle on her. I watched the arithmetic reach her face. "I did land on my feet," I said. "Now it's your turn." I stood up. I set the phone receiver back on its hook carefully, the way you put down something that once mattered to you. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the door and nodded to the corrections officer, and she buzzed me through. I did not look back. The drive back from Sheridan is about 3 hours if you take the coast route through Astoria. I took the coast route. The Pacific was steel gray and enormous on my left, the kind of ocean that doesn't care what you've been through and somehow makes that comforting. I pulled over once, just north of Seaside, and sat with the engine off and the window down and listened to the surf for a long time. 12 years. I had been 64 when it happened, which is old enough that most people would have decided the story was over. Most would have taken those $200 to a shelter, filed for whatever assistance they qualified for, and spent what remained of their life letting the anger eat them from the inside out. I had not done that. Not because I was particularly strong or wise, but because I was stubborn in the way men who've worked with their hands their whole lives tend to be stubborn, not eloquent about it, just unable to stop moving. The Anchor Point Foundation has housed 214 veterans in the last 4 years. We have 3 more projects under construction. The $200 fund has helped 41 elderly individuals recover assets fraudulently taken by family members. 41. And that number grows every month. Every Saturday morning, Quinn drives up from Corvallis, 3 hours on I-5, and we have coffee on the back porch and watch the water. She asks me questions about the foundation, about the projects, about what it takes to build a particular structure in a particular kind of weather. She is learning to read blueprints. Last month she told me she wants to go to law school, that she wants to work in elder law. I told her my attorney would be a good person to talk to about that. She laughed. It's her grandmother's laugh. It's the same cadence, the same slight surprise in it, and every time I hear it, I am briefly and completely ambushed by the grief of losing my wife, who died before any of this happened and never knew how the story ended. I think she would have liked Quinn. I think she would have recognized her. The $200 sits on the wall of my office now. Not the original bills, those are long gone. A photograph of them, taken the morning I woke up in that hospital bed and understood what had happened. The photograph is in a simple black frame, and beneath it is a single printed line. "You'll land on your feet." I kept it because it is the most honest thing anyone ever said to me, even if they said it to get rid of me, even if they never intended it to be true. It turned out to be the best advice I ever received.